and then well, hello everyone, good afternoon and good morning for those of us who watch from across the Atlantic. Welcome to this policy dialogue on Tunisia 10 years after the Arab Spring. I'm Mihai Chihaia, I'm a policy analyst with the European Policy Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. This event is part of the engagement that the EPC does on the Middle East and North Africa. We had a couple of weeks ago an event on Iran and the future US and EU policy on Iran, and now I have the pleasure to welcome you at this timely discussion on Tunisia. Before we move into discussion, maybe just a couple of words to set the scene for our speakers today. Well, 10 years ago in Tunisia, it was the start of the Arab Spring. There have been many achievements, and it has been regarded by many as a democratic transition success story. Of course, in spite of this, there are still some political, economic, security issues that still persist. Issues such as frequent political leadership changes that create a certain degree of political instability. Of course, there have been slow economic reform that have been stalled. There's also at the same time a high level of unemployment, and also unemployment among youth. At the same time, then there's also a lack of trust in public institutions that contribute to these problems. And all of this has been exacerbated also by the pandemic that started in 2020, which also brought a new set of challenges. So I think against this background, if we also add the last month's protests that are also in reaction of these challenges that I mentioned, I think there are a few key questions that we need to address, a few questions that we'll focus on today. Questions such as what has been achieved since 2011, what are the political, economic, security issues that still persist, what are the solutions to these issues, what is the role of the US and the EU in this picture. Well, fortunately, I don't have to answer these questions. That's why we have an excellent panel with us today, a panel comprised of Youssef Cherif, who's a well-known political analyst and also director of the Columbia Global Center in Tunis. Then we also have with us Imen Belhedi, which is the country director for Tunisia for the Search for Common Ground. Then we also have Ambassador Gordon Gray with us, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the Center for American Progress and also former US Ambassador in Tunisia. He was there on the ground during the events on the Arab Spring. And we also hope to welcome with us soon Fabio Massimo Castaldo, who is the member of the European Parliament and also Vice President of the European Parliament. Now, before we move into discussion, maybe a couple of logistical aspects. Each speaker will give a few introductory remarks, like 5, 8, 10 minutes max. Then we'll have a small discussion with the speakers, and then I'll open the floor for the questions from the audience. Well, to ask questions, there are basically two options. On the bottom of your screen, you have the Q&A box. You can type there your question, I'll read it out loud, and then we'll see which speaker would like to address it, which one is best fit to address it. There is also a second option, which is to raise your hand. You have the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you raise your hand, then I'll give you the floor. My colleagues will unmute you, and then you can ask your question directly. And with this being said, I think we can go into discussion, and I'll just give the floor to Youssef for a couple of opening remarks. Youssef, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I will just start quickly by nuancing the title. The uprising failed to deliver at the economic level, that's true. But the simple fact that we're talking now in this webinar, at least for myself and whoever is in Tunisia or attending this webinar from Tunisia, the simple fact that we're doing this, also the simple fact that people outside are cursing the authorities and cursing the revolution, shows that at the level of democracy and freedom of expression, the uprising delivered and the transition goes on. And I insist on the transition goes on. But the years between 2011 and 2020 represent the freest and longest democratic period in Tunisia's contemporary history. And in 50 or 100 years from now, Tunisians and Arabs will remember these years the way Germans remember the Weimar Republic or Czechs the Prague Spring. So this is a very important moment for Tunisia's history. Whether it succeeds, whether it fails, it's there, and it will be remembered, and future generations of Tunisians and Arabs will build on it in their hopefully long road to freedom and democracy. Having said this, I completely agree that the picture is not rosy, and I think we should talk about what went wrong in the last 10 years and what is still wrong today. So the first thing I will start with is that those who demonstrated against dictatorship in 2010 and 2011 had multiple goals. Few of them wanted democracy and human rights, but the chief slogans of that period were about better jobs and more equality. The movement of that period was also concerned with police brutality and state corruption, hence the calls for dignity by then, if you remember, the major calls and slogans of 2010, 2011. But when we look 10 years later, the issues of economic development, corruption, judiciary conservatism, judiciary police brutality, all these issues were not solved in Tunisia. Hence the ongoing discontent. And I think some of you mentioned already the ongoing demonstrations in Tunisia. And you add to this the fact that in recent months, several young Tunisians, maybe even hundreds of young Tunisians, were sent to jail for quasi-unfounded reasons. And many local and international organizations are condemning this turn of events and warning that this is maybe a slide in the democratic transition. And actually, the politicians, the Tunisian politicians, instead of rethinking the country's economic model, instead of building strong democratic institutions, they lost their energy, and they put all their energy, at least in the first years following the revolution, they put all their energy on Islam and secularism. So one side, another Islamists used to accuse its opponents of being the enemies of Islam. The other side, leftists and other secularists, used to call their foes terrorists and foreign agents. And this was something that you could hear or read everywhere in Tunisia, at least in the first years following the revolution, in the founding years of the democratic transition in Tunisia. So that's how it started, and how it's going is not much better. So in the last 10 years as well, we've seen terrorism and we've seen pro-authoritarian currents emerging in the country or strengthening in the country, and that, added to the polarization I just mentioned, created a big mess at the political level. So this ideological polarization became a defining characteristic of Tunisian politics. Add to that the inability of political parties and political groups to emerge as structured forces. So every election, we see the emergence of newcomers to politics, often with no plans, with no background in politics, who are just elected because they are very good speakers, good populists, they have money, things like that. So they get elected, and then they cannot really deliver. So this has weakened democracy, or created a weak or fragile democracy. It contributed in deteriorating the economic conditions of citizens. And I think maybe as importantly, it diminished the trust of Tunisians in their politicians and in democracy. This is at the local level. This is the domestic context. But then the international context is not much better. The international context is not very favorable to democracy nowadays. This is definitely not Eastern Europe in the late 80s. In the MENA region, most regimes remain opposed to democracy. So you can say that there is a major counter-revolution happening in the MENA region against democracy. And some MENA regions are actually trying to stop democracy outside their own borders, not just internally. When you look around Tunisia, France, which is the closest democratic partner of the country, France doesn't seem very interested in democracy. France is more interested in countering political Islam, in countering Turkish influence in Tunisia, than in spreading democracy in this country. Italy, the other major democratic partner of Tunisia, is more concerned with issues related to migration, for instance, than with the promotion of democracy. And by the way, I mean, the Tunisian political system is learning a lot from Italy. This recurrent change of governments that we see in Tunisia, we've seen that before in Italy, and we keep seeing it in Italy. So this is the major situation. Now, as I said, the situation is not rosy, but there are some positive aspects, and I will conclude with this positive note. One, it's true that there are a lot of countries that are opposed to Tunisia's democracy or not very interested in Tunisian democracy, but the European Union as a bloc is supportive of the transition. Germany continues to be a strong advocate of Tunisian democracy, and a lot of German politicians and a lot of German foundations, all German foundations actually work in Tunisia and believe that democracy can deliver in Tunisia and democracy can improve the life of Tunisians in the future. There is also the arrival of Joe Biden in the White House, and Ambassador Gray can talk about this more than I do, but I think the team of Joe Biden is quite supportive of democracy and can believe that a democratic Tunisia is better than an authoritarian Tunisia. And for the Arab world, I think, although, as I said, there are a lot of Arab regimes that are opposed to democracy, Tunisia is still considered a possible alternative. It still shows that democratic alternative is possible. So Arabs see that oppressive regimes are not eternal, that the alternative to dictatorship is not chaos and Islamist extremism. And foreigners who used to have a lot of theories about how Arabs cannot live in democracy, or Arabs do not want democracy, or they see Tunisia and, well, it's an Arab country where democracy is not perfect, but it is still functioning. And again, it's been 10 years. So to conclude, 10 years after the revolution, a new generation of Tunisians has emerged, young men and women who grew up in a democratic context and are little afraid of state oppression, of state repression. And we've seen them these days demonstrating and fighting more or less peacefully against the police, getting arrested, but going on. They are widely connected to the internet, so everything that happens to them is known locally and abroad, and they can form in the future, and I think they began creating a creative force that could reshape the country in a different manner once the older generation passes the floor. So these street movements, the street movements that we see today in Tunisia, are perhaps the voice of this new generation trying to be heard. And I conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Youssef. You certainly put out there a lot of aspects. You also ended in a very positive note, also pointing out the positive aspects, of course. I'll maybe just have one follow-up question. You mentioned the inability of political forces, of political parties to deliver. How do you think they could achieve these political compromises needed for measures to go forward? And I mean for economic measures to go forward and achieve their goal?
Well, I think this philosophy of compromise is, in a way, of compromising is part of the problem, because the international community kept pushing Tunisian political parties and political groups to find a compromise, to go towards the consensus, without seeing that many of these political parties and political groups are actually not representative. So they have a brand, they have a name, they have a voice in the media, but they don't have real supporters, or they don't have real weight in the street and on the ground. So I think before the consensus, before going for consensus. What is needed is genuine political parties and genuine political groups, or at least the current political parties getting real popular support. How can they achieve that? I think that's the $1 million question, because until now, no one was able to do it. Apart from Ennahda, they do have their constituency. The other parties, they hardly do that. Maybe one of the main explanation why it didn't work in most of these parties, one of the main explanation is that the ego of the leaders is the main thing that is making, transforming the political party into an dictatorial instrument in a democratic environment. So if there is a new generation of leaders who can believe more in the institution and believe more in common work in political parties, instead of thinking of their own image and their own advancement, maybe then we will have more sustainable political parties that then can work towards consensus and towards building something sustainable for the country. And I think we are starting to see it among a few political parties in Tunisia.
Thank you very much, Youssef. Now I'll just turn to you, Imen, for a couple of thoughts from your side. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mihai. Thank you, Youssef. And I'm sorry to bring you to not a rosy and not a very optimistic side like Youssef, but maybe it's the voice of age, let's say, which will speak. As I worked for a very long time with youth, and I will say that I understand them. So the situation of this new generation in Tunisia isn't so easy. They are suffering. Unfortunately, they have not a good situation. Today, Tunisians continue to take the street. They are in the street, and you know that during 1 month, during January and till now, and maybe next week also, we are living we are living several manifestations from youth and from other from several organizations, which is good, I think, which is good because now youth are expressing what they need, and they are expressing that no one is understanding them. So the absence of failure of local development policies in Tunisia, a massive and structural unemployment rate, a political class that has totally failed over the last 10 years to translate the aspirations, as you said, Youssef, of the Tunisian people, and especially youth, into deep reforms. I think that there are the obvious symptom of a deep malaise in Tunisia now. We have an external debt which amount to 75% of the gross domestic product, and could increase maybe in 2021 to 90. We have more than 60% the unemployment percentage. We have a situation of women law which is decreasing, and the violence against women is increasing now in Tunisia. 10 years after January 14th, 2011, the transition is still underway, unfortunately. The country socio-economic situation has deteriorated, but we still believe that tomorrow could be a better day, and we could have a better situation, but we have to work on it very seriously. The political instability, we are living a very hard situation of political instability, which is due to a political regime that is not adequate for a period of democratic transition. We have this political regime and this consensus that we are are usually looking for isn't the best solution for Tunisia now. We can't have it. And we are since 3 weeks, let's say, without an established government. So now, 10 years after the revolution, we arrived to the 13th governments with the first and the second Mishishi government. We have now 227 political parties, which was established. So I think that the political situation and the recent, let's say, serious stalemate between the presidents of the government, the president of the parliament, and the president of the republic is significant, and it shows us that that the consensus isn't the best way of governing Tunisia. It's blocking the country. During COVID, the COVID pandemic revealed the scale of the vulnerability in Tunisia. It affects all the sectors. It's especially the more vulnerable categories: informal settlers, immigrants, sub-Saharan Africans, and employed people. So the COVID pandemic shows us that we haven't a strong system, to help people, as we have learned from our current work with Ministry of Social Affairs in several projects. Social workers who are most directly in contact with the vulnerable, with these vulnerable populations, suffer from lack of personal protective equipment, capacity to manage the conflict situation, and they are really suffering during the COVID, and they are disarmed. They haven't tools to work. So as I said, the unemployment rate now is 16, and it's more than 30 with among graduates. The country has more than 1 million based on research. We have about 1.5 million needs, so neither student nor employee nor in training among the young people. Young people now, youth in Tunisia is representing 57% of the population, which is a quite big number, and which push us to work with them and to understand their needs. Now, irregular migration, let's talk about it also, because it's important nowadays. Irregular migration now has taken the form of a protest movement against the reality, against the sad reality in the society, and has become an obsession for families, and not only individual, not only youth. Now we are seeing, we saw some families going together and making this immigrant irregular immigration together. So in this very fragile context, the risk of recruitment of extremist groups is very present. Parliamentary group sharing some of the same ideology of the Islamist group gives a sort of legitimacy of these groups. So the risk of the rise of violence in the street and the violence in the parliament, in political life, is a factor in the trivialization of violence, because now now and based on research conducted by Search for Common Ground in Tunisia, and especially for the progress report on the implementation of UN 2250 UN resolution, we saw that we conclude that a widespread despair characterizes the psychological state of young people in Tunisia, and this youth is becoming very fragile, and with resignation from the families, with the absence or lack of facilities of let's say youth institution which could or work with youth, and which could would give them a safe space to express their needs, and to help them to meet their aspirations. I will not talk about the clashes between protesters and office and security forces during these weeks, and we will see in recent weeks, young activists has experienced a very hard experience, and a large wave of arrests, including over 1,100 young people with 600 minors. Based on UNICEF statistics, we saw kidnapping, attacks on personal data, several arrestations between among sports teams, or let's say ultra groups also took place last weeks. I will not talk any more on demonstrations, but I will try to give more some elements of answers, or some piece of solutions, let's say, to help public institutions, to help let's say donors, and to help the international cooperation to find and this transition, to find solution to help Tunisia to succeed its transition. I think, and based on what we are doing on field at Search for Common Ground, especially with some public institutions, Ministry of Youth, Ministry of Social Affairs, and also a lot of work with CSOs, with local CSOs. I think that the face of social movements, and in the face of social movements, the security response alone is not viable and lasting situation. This is all the more true when the protest movement is led by young people. So and sometimes they are children, and not only not even young people. It is important, I think, to balance the hard power approach with which was immediately adopted during these weeks by a softer approach. A strong signal is needed, such as the importance of SSR projects, community policing dialogue, trust building, as Search and other are doing in Tunisia. We have to communicate. We have to find solution, and to give place to communicate between all the stakeholders and with young. The establishment of a local dialogue with these same young protesters, it's very important. We have to do it now. It's urgent. We have to make this dialogue with with them and to give them the floor and to listen to them. So then it's necessary to set up a program that includes a climate of confidence for the social for these young people. This program could consist the involvement of the civil society, of local civil society in the communities, the informal groups of young people, in particular ultra groups, and I'm focusing on that because we know they are representing leaders now, because we have, let's say, I will say, in the absence of leaders, ultra are becoming leaders because youth are feeling themselves in solidarity in a group. They have the same identity. So let's talk with them, let's discuss with them, let's listen to them, and let's try to find solution with them, for them. So I think that the community-based development with youth is very, very important now. We have to give them the chance to develop by themselves solution for their problems. When we will responsibilize them and make and work with them in a collaborative way, I'm sure that they will give us the added value, and they will give us the right solution. We can't give them the solution. We have to listen to them to give us the solution, because we don't know their reality better than them. So we have to integrating young people working in the informal sector, because now the informal sector is the most important employment sector. So we have to include them and to remove by removing sanctions against small informal businesses in favor of a supportive approach. It's also imperative to put in place a program for the integration of needs and for their engagement into schools and training. These needs, we have to reintegrate them, social reintegration, economic reintegration, and cultural integration also. We have also to develop the CSR, the corporate social responsibility initiative with social partners like UTICA, Connect, UGTT. We have to also give them or ask them to participate, especially at this crucial time for the economy, for the reintegration économique of this youth. Another maybe piece or way or answer is to the development of communication and media programs to rebuild young people's confidence in representative of public authorities, mainly security forces. The parliament, what we are seeing now, what is happening now, it broke the trust. It broke the there is not a gap, but let's say I will not be very pessimistic, but I think that the relationship is broken now. So we have to rebuild it. We have to rebuild the trust and to try to make this communication between these two groups, because one of the main causes of recruitment of these of extremist groups are how to say it, the relationship, this relationship between security forces and youth. I will also suggest encouraging the creation of formal and informal coordination mechanism between public institutions and civil society organization and the national and local levels, because I think that we have a lot of structures. We have a lot of law. We have a lot of grants. The money is here, but it's very, very bad managed, and it doesn't go to the right place, and it's not managed by the right person. So let's try to find solutions with what we have now, what our friends offer to us, our international cooperation, what international cooperation offer to us. So these are some elements that I wanted to share with you. Sorry for being, especially for my bad language, very modest language of English language, and this, let's say, this attitude, because I really believe that that we can succeed. I really believe that we can find solution for our problems, but just to discuss and to diminish the ego of our leaders now. So if we find solution for this ego, we will make a deblocage in our country, and I think that these young people can make the change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imen. This has been very, very insightful. You already put out there also a few solutions. That was, of course, from the beginning, I had a question, which would be the solutions to these issues, but you already kind of tackled on that. Now, I just quickly would like to welcome Fabio Castaldo. Thank you for joining us. Now we'll quickly go to Ambassador Gray for a couple of few thoughts, and then we'll go with you, Fabio. Ambassador Gray, please, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the European Policy Center for hosting this event, and also for inviting me to participate. And I agree with many of the points that Youssef and Imen made. And Imen, your English is perfect, so don't apologize for it. I'll try not to cover the same ground, but I'll try and offer the perspective of a foreign diplomat who was serving in Tunisia at the time that the revolution began there. And just to offer a little bit of perspective, looking back 10 years, by the end of 2011, not only had Ben Ali been forced to flee his country, but Gaddafi, Mubarak, and Ali Abdullah Saleh had also been ousted from power following the massive protests we saw. And I'm still waiting to meet anyone who had predicted on January 1st, 2011, that these four authoritarian rulers who had ruled their countries for 129 years combined would be gone by the end of that year. And those aren't the only ones. We saw the protests in Algeria and in Sudan in 2019 led to the ousting of Bouteflika and Bashir. And I say this because we shouldn't take the Tunisian revolution for granted. The Tunisian people deserve a great deal of credit for what they started, not only in their own country, but I would say throughout North Africa and the Middle East. When I concluded my assignment in Tunisia in early July 2012, so about a year and a half after Ben Ali fled, it struck me and my colleagues at the embassy that Tunisia would need to surmount three major challenges to ensure the success of its transition. And we put them into three baskets: political, security, and economic, and I'll address them briefly in turn. I think on the political side, in many regards, the political transition has been successful. We've seen several rounds of free and fair elections, starting with the October 23rd, 2011 elections for the Constituent Assembly. I'd note that Tunisia's parliament today, 29% of the parliament is female, and that compares favorably with the United States, where it's 27% of the representation in the House is female and only 24% of the representation in the Senate is. That Constituent Assembly wrote a new constitution. Tunisia's seen several peaceful transitions of power, both following elections and the death of the president. We may all agree there have been too many transitions of power, but we should remember that they have all been peaceful. And to reinforce the point that Youssef made in his remarks, none of the protests that we're seeing now would have been possible before the revolution. This very discussion wouldn't have been possible with our Tunisian participants before the revolution, nor would anyone be able to watch it on YouTube. And I say this because I don't think we should take these political accomplishments for granted. They weren't preordained, but they came about because of the strength of Tunisian civil society and the willingness of Tunisian political leaders to compromise. But on another level, as both Youssef and Imen have made clear, the Tunisian revolution has not lived up to its potential, particularly in the socioeconomic sphere, for all the points they made. And one of the reasons it hasn't, I'd like to quote an analysis that Sharon Gruel had written for a post on the Monkey Cage blog here in Washington, and I'll quote him because I thought it was very good analysis. He said, but ironically, the same factors that helped Tunisia's transition survive its early years have since constrained its transition. Each of these factors, the willingness to compromise, a weak security sector, and a powerful civil society, have in their own ways inhibited the consolidation of Tunisia's democracy, end quote. And his point was that the focus on compromise and the strength of competing civil society groups meant that hard decisions were never made, and particularly not on issues such as the economy. Let me turn quickly to the security basket of issues. When I left Tunisia in July 2012, there were real questions about Tunisia's ability to defend itself against both internal and external threats. It struck us at the embassy that the Salafist threat was growing and that the government at the time did not understand the gravity of the challenge and wasn't willing to deal with it. And unfortunately, our forebodings were borne out. There was the September 2012 Salafist attack against our embassy. In 2013, the assassinations of Shokri Belhedi and Mohammed Brahimi. 2015 terrorist attacks at the Bardo and in Sousse. But over time, I think the security situation has improved, thanks in part to security assistance from the United States and others. And I think that Tunisian capabilities and Tunisia's ability to defend itself have increased markedly. I don't want to at all diminish the threat that's very real. Issues remain, be it human trafficking, the return of foreign fighters, the unstable situation in Libya in particular. And just yesterday, very sadly, 4 Tunisian soldiers on patrol in the border near Algeria were killed when their vehicle went over a landmine, and our thoughts are with their families at this terrible time. On the economy is the third set of challenges that we had identified, and perhaps the most daunting. One of the best explanations I heard for the cause of the revolution came from a prominent member of civil society. He told me just days after Ben Ali fled that poverty and unemployment exist anywhere. This happened, meaning revolution, because of a loss of dignity and a lack of dialogue. And that really struck with me. There is dialogue in Tunisia today. There's freedom of expression. I'd say that without at all disagreeing with your point, Imen, that even more dialogue, particularly with youth, is needed. But on the dignity point, I think dignity includes having the same opportunities as everyone else, and at its very core, having a sense of self-worth, and that often comes from having a job. And I think the current protests in Tunisia should dispel any doubts about the pain that unemployment causes. Let me say just a few words about how Tunisia is viewed in the United States. Fortunately, support for Tunisia is broad bipartisan support in Congress. Youssef, as you suggested, fairly diplomatically, I'd add, the Trump administration was not particularly interested in promoting democratic values or in the bilateral relationship. It cut the budget request for assistance for Tunisia each year, but Congress just overrode that. In the 2020 fiscal year, for example, Congress appropriated 3 times as much money as the Trump administration requested. That being said, Tunisia is not going to be at or even near the top of the Biden administration's agenda, but I am confident that the Biden administration, as you suggested, Youssef, is going to have a predisposition to having building back the relationship with Tunisia so that it's stronger than it was before. And I also think the Biden administration is going to be a lot more active in supporting efforts, particularly by the UN, to bring stability to Libya, in marked contrast to the Trump administration. And I think that's going to be very important for Tunisia's stability and the successful continuation of its transition. So I think I want to close on a positive note. In observing Tunisia over the past decade, admittedly as a foreigner, but perhaps as a sympathetic foreigner, I've really been impressed by the resilience of Tunisian civil society, its ability time and time again to surmount challenges. I think it's incumbent on its foreign friends, be they in the United States, Europe, elsewhere, to help with that transition to the extent that we can. And I'll end there on a positive note. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gordon, for bringing a multiple perspective to the discussion. You also, of course, mentioned from your experience there on the ground, but also you looked a bit forward into what the Biden administration can bring into the Tunisia-US relations. Now, of course, I myself have quite a few questions, but I know that Fabio has to leave earlier, if I'm not mistaken. I just want to give him enough space to bring into discussion the EU angle. So Fabio, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, dear Mihai, and thanks to all of you for this opportunity to speak, to share some remarks, dear honorable guests and speakers of today. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to participate in the debate and to enrich with sharing some of my perspectives together with the other friends that has been invited by the European Policy Center for this stimulating exchange. And also, let me say that the topic, the transition, and what is the next page of the Tunisian democracy has a special relevance for me in my activity as MEP, because I've been focusing especially on the Mediterranean region and in its evolutions in these years, and I've been rapporteur of the 2016 Tunisia report. And also I had the honor to be observer 3 times in the for the European Union, and in the last two cases, 2018 and 2019, chief observer for the European Union election observation missions for the Tunisian general elections and presidential one in 2019, and for the local one in 2018. I have always thought that this country, one of the most dynamic of Africa, represents a democratic bulwark of fundamental importance in an increasingly uncertain Mediterranean scenario, but also is a paradigm, is a model for the whole Arab and Islamic world. Quotes between the latent instability in Algeria on one hand and the Libyan civil war and the growing assertive Egypt on the other, Tunisia was the cradle of the so-called Arab Springs in 2010-2011, which began in Tunis with the extreme sacrifice of Mohamed Bouazizi. The Arab Springs triggered a sudden change in the whole region. Many old regimes fell, some states resisted, some other collapsed due to the civil wars and sectarian clashes, opening new challenges for the security in the whole area. To take stock of this movement almost 10 years later can open a debate that would linger on the many lights and shadows that inevitably emerge from those years. Considering the conflicts that have unfolded in Syria and Libya or the return of the military dictatorship in Egypt, Tunisia is nevertheless, again, an outstanding exception, is the model disregarding the difficulties that is experiencing, to which all the Arab civil societies are still looking nowadays. A decade after the start of the Jasmine Revolution, however, this label of Tunisia as a successful example of democratic transition following the Arab Spring is being increasingly questioned, especially inside the country. The scenario that we are presented with today, a wave of unrest in the country, while politicians debate over a proposed new government, the fifth since 2019 inconclusive elections, compels us to question whether the Tunisia's uprising failed to deliver on its promises, not on the political level, but on the economic and the social one. Tunisia is in the midst of a deep economic crisis. GDP fell down by 9% last year. Inflation has skyrocketed, and a third of young people are actually unemployed. The pandemic has exacerbated an already dire macroeconomic situation, destroying the country's vital tourist industry that was already extremely affected by the terroristic attacks a few years ago and was just now starting to relaunch itself, and closing down opportunities for the type of casual day labor that kept many families afloat. 60% of those on a coronavirus-related work leave did not receive any remuneration. This percentage amongst the two lowest income quantiles was as high as 80%. Anger over government inaction, aggravated by police violence, has exploded. The turmoil that erupted in mid-January is the result of an accumulation of frustration, lack of perspective, and hope, especially by the youngsters. The issues people contest today are indeed largely the same as 10 years ago: unemployment, regional socioeconomic disparities, and endemic corruption. The youth is holding accountable system that does not allow them to thrive, a state failing to provide basic infrastructure and services for its citizens, especially marginalized areas, and which is first and foremost represented by security forces. The political class is accused of having failed to deliver a good governance a decade after the 2011 revolution that toppled longtime President Ben Ali. Yet, the Tunisian case cannot be, in my opinion, fully understood with the simplification adopted by many medias, which moved from describing it as an unquestionable success of democracy on the southern shore of the Mediterranean to an equally blatant failure. This is not the clear polarization that is in front of us. Tunisian current situation, in my opinion, must be understood as the result of these decades of oppression and the political elite that is still struggling to adjust. The young democracy and its political class inherited titanic challenges for the transition: employment, public debt, corruption, internal security, and an unresolved youth issue. Reforms to be continued, importantly, extremely important, in my opinion, the public administration and unsustainable neighborhood. And I want to stress on the public administration because, of course, you know that European Union mobilized important funds in percentage, looking at the percentage of the population, probably the strongest fund that has been mobilized among all the different other bilateral action of the European Union. But if you do not have prompt and efficient public administration to employ them quickly where are needed. If bureaucracy, if complication is a certain even fear of the signatures is prevailing, then of course the effect, the spillover effect of this kind of bilateral engagement, it cannot deploy its full perspective. I was always personally in favor to strengthen even more this kind of support. In the report I wrote in 2016, there was an extremely revolutionary idea that was voted by a very large majority of the colleagues in the European Parliament that was focused on the idea of the reconversion of the debt into investment, to reconvert all the Tunisian public debt in investment, the one who is kept for sure by European Union actors. But, and it is something we didn't do even for Greece, that is a member of the European Union. So having found a consensus among the European members of the European Parliament, among different families, meant that really there was a recognition of what is the important political value of the Tunisian transition and the Tunisian democracy. Nevertheless, of course, we need both elements on board to be effective. And if the administration is not ready to use and to mobilize the means, it's also very difficult to win the political battle to even strengthen them. Also, we have to take in account that part of the frustration is also linked to the transitional justice. It is certainly is a very complex process that needs to be taken into account. A process that has encountered extreme difficulties, as many have questioned the interoperability of the court in charge, and that left within the population a feeling of overall frustration towards the establishment. Corruption is indeed still very much felt in the country. The last government impasse is due precisely to the reshuffles of the country's coalition government, which included 4 ministers accused of either corruption or conflict of interest, and that was explicitly rejected by the president Chihaia, that has been elected exactly because in that moment, the population wanted a strong reaction against somehow what was perceived the elite. It was an independent candidate that was focusing most of his campaign exactly saying, I'm not part of this elite, I'm not part of this way of acting inside the political arena, and I can be the one who will defend the state from the corruption and the conflict of interest. At least that was a big main issue mentioned in his campaign. Moreover, that we have to consider the internal and regional security issues faced by the country. In recent years, we have to recognize that Tunisia has made enormous efforts in the fight against terrorism, increasing spending also from its defense budget on counter-terrorism, and that has obviously put a huge strain on its public investment possibilities in the sectors that were most needed. Somehow, Tunisia is also paying not just for its own security, but also for our security, because there is no security and stability also in the northern shore of the Mediterranean if there is not in the south. And to this, it has to be added that critical geopolitical situation that persists in Tunisia's neighborhood. The country, as I told you at the beginning, found itself in the midst between the Libyan civil war that was also depriving Tunisia of an extremely important market for its export, and Algeria, that despite the good cooperation on security has also experienced a strong internal instability. Now we know all the change of presidency, this important message for the future, but still have also important social and economical problems to face. The Libyan conflict continued to have particularly devastating implications in Tunisia, as Libya represented a very important market, as I was saying, a rich and culturally linked, especially between the south of Tunisia and Tripolitania, that have strong ties, also tribal and ethnical strong ties, and also because this is part of the Tunisian debate, because the political debate, because also the division of the sphere of influence in Libya has an impact inside the political landscape and scenario and the affiliation and sympathies of the different Tunisian parties. All these challenges and constraints contributed to undermine any hope for the kind of the political consensus Tunisia needs to weather through the pandemic storm and make the systemic reforms protesters seek. Tunisia as I told you, is a peculiar and diverse nation divided along also an axis that cuts the country from northwest to southeast. In its eastern and northern part, the coast is highly urbanized, very open towards Europe and West, and with a high level of education, very much also devoted to trade and tourism, while in the country in the southern part and the western areas are more linked to the identities of the Maghreb, with also higher level of poverty and little economic development and huge inequalities that are also creating a ground much prone to the risk of radicalization. This fragmentation, as I was telling you before, as reflected in the country political life, 9 different heads of government and even more cabinets, along with the recurring fights in the fragmented parliament, have forced politicians to spend most of their time trying to achieve consensus rather than looking for solutions for some of the most pressing issues, pointing to the dire need for a minimum of stability to implement reforms. It's a matter of fact that if there is such a huge fragmentation and a huge division, politicians are more focused on the next elections more than on the next generations, because the need to survive politically will have more space in the debate than the structural reforms that are needed to be effective. And this is also due to the Tunisian electoral system that, in my opinion, that is based on a very strongly proportional electoral law without significant thresholds, without any correction of this proportionalism, but that it was very good for the transition after the dictatorship, as it was experienced in other countries of Europe that did in recent decades transitions. But now I'm not so sure it's so adapted to deliver a government that will be able to be enough stable and effective to deliver results. And so this is also part of the very strong political debate. Today is, so in my opinion, blatantly creating unsettling problems of governance, and to overcome the standoff maybe would be required to have a wide agreement between the political forces to try to resolve when the most urgent problems of the country will be faced, this long-lasting debate on electoral reform. Of course, let's say there are other important issues that we have to take into and board, and also recognize that with all these difficulties notwithstanding, since 2010, Tunisia has made considerable progresses on the political and civil rights front. Just to mention you, according to the index that has been compiled by Freedom House, from 2010 to 2019, the country has risen from 23 points to 70 in its thermometer of democracy, and moreover has been a remarkable improvement also in freedom of access and expression on the internet, from 19 points in 2011 to 64 in 2019, and I was witness of that. This is a very vibrant democracy on the mediatic field also, and with an extremely strong civil society. It's not by chance that this civil society won the Nobel Prize for Peace, the so-called quartet. And so this is not, in my opinion, too much put in question. It's more the capability, as I was saying, to deliver the reforms on the economic and social side. It is undermining also the faith and the trust that the generation, especially the younger generation, have in front of their the political parties that are supposed to represent them inside the spectrum. I would like also to say that there are other important elements must try to be completed in this regard, and it remains crucial to address the situation also of the Constitutional Court. It's still not operational. It was part of my recommendation as chief observer in 2018, again in 2019. Unfortunately, Constitutional Court, that is a crucial role just because it's as the essential possibility to also to put in legislation in condition to be adapted to the new constitution of 2015, as it happened, for example, even in the Italian transition after the fascism, or in many others constitutional system after the transition, after the dictatorship, because often the political class is unwilling to take action to intervene, and then therefore the Constitutional Court will be able to give interpretation of the present law according to the constitutional principles, or to push the legislator to do his job and to deliver and to fulfill the vacuum that will be created with a possible condemnation somehow, the abrogation of the parts of the laws that are partially unconstitutional. And unfortunately, what happened is that the appointment of the judges of the Constitutional Court enter into a kind of political fight among the political parties to decide to which tendencies should have the judges that will be appointed. So somehow trying to change the nature of the body, there should be a jurisdictional one, and then trying to make it somehow a political one. And this is, of course, an aspect that is making democracy more fragile and somehow ill-equipped to regulate also the distribution of power also, and the warranty, the constitutional warranty in the country's political regime. So again, I will call strongly to try to resolve and to take politics out of the appointment of judges that should be based on their quality or their academic skills or their prominent, of course, skills, and not, of course, based on other sensibilities and issues. Let me say, just going to the conclusion that again, Tunisia is still nowadays a strong model that was able to rise up from anger and to overthrow a dictator, the first of several to fall across the Arab world, but the only one to deliver constant results still nowadays. Instability has continued to rock Tunisia, and as its successive governments has failed to tackle the growing disparity and the mounting social anger, also for the difficulties to deal with the strong economical domestic powers of the most prominent, let's say, actors inside the Tunisian landscape that are a bit hostile to accept some reforms that are perceived eventually as a threat for them. Some structural problems so remain, and economic hardship worsened because of the pandemic. And what is making now difference that the younger Tunisians especially are no longer keeping quiet. From hope, they are switching to fear, and then from fear, they are switching to rage. And across Tunisia, civil societies group and people from marginalized districts are demanding economic development and also to brutality and the release of an estimated 1,400 people arrested in the disturbances. Today, it is clear that the genuine democratic transition consistent with the aspirations of the people and the constitutional achievements requires new public policies that should be based on the greater social justice, dignity for all the Tunisians, capable of breaking with a model no longer able to give concrete answers to Tunisian citizens, demands of a more equally redistributed and sustainable development on the country. So let me say that on one hand, I would say to the political class of Tunisia that this is not the time of tacticism. This is the time to deliver. And if they will not deliver, somehow people will not just lose faith in one party or another, they will lose faith in democracy. They will think that what they have done, all the sacrifice, the people that died, the people that were injured, this incredible, genuine, strong feeling of participation that I was witnessing in 2014, that I was witnessing again in 2018 and 19, will be an illusion. But I'm also warning the European institutions on my other side. I never stopped to push for a more assertive and strong cooperation. Let understand to my colleagues that you cannot evaluate Tunisia just on the size of its population or just, of course, on the size of its economy. The Tunisian model has the capability to give an influence, to have impact in the whole Arab world, not just in the whole Maghreb, but in the whole Arab world and even in the whole Africa. This is the model to which the civil societies are really looking for. If this model will fail, and many other countries, also Arab authoritarian regimes, just to be very clear, would be somehow very happy to see another model taking place, maybe again a kind of authoritarian regime, or not even an authoritarian democracy, as we are observing in other parts of the world, including Europe. So this is the big warning. We must try to get really ready for disappointment. I always ask also to try to think about the so-called ALECA, the CFTA, not in terms of a symmetrical agreement, but it must be asymmetrical by default, taking into account that on one side you have a very strong and competitive market, and on the other side you have a relatively small one in which there are huge fear of possible consequences, unemployment, erosion of rights. No, we have to make it an instrument to improve the condition, the growth, the employment, the education of the Tunisia, because this is will work really incredibly in terms of geopolitical impact, also of the European way to geopolitics, the European way to multilateralism. If we will really make Tunisia, will give Tunisia all these elements to be that model, this will be an extraordinary payback for the European way to act as a geopolitical power based on cooperation, based on soft approach. But of course, again, if we will lack that part of the puzzle that is represented by the public administration performance, by the capability of politics to seize those opportunity, I would fear that both sides of the Mediterranean will harshly regret the incredible occasion we are missing in this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio. This has been very insightful. You definitely put out there and tackled many topics that also the other speakers touched upon. I would maybe just now move into the Q&A session. And I understand, Fabio, that you need to leave soon in a couple of minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
I can stay a bit longer, no worry. I will try to answer to a few questions with pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, just to go into the Q&A, we have a question, and sorry for mispronouncing the names, from Takui Keriji, who's asking what else could international partners do to help Tunisia's transition? And maybe now I would just maybe give the floor to Gordon first, maybe for a couple of words, and then sort of going into a reverse order, and maybe then Imen can say a couple of words, and maybe you, Youssef, have something to add to this.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think what international partners who want to assist Tunisia and the Tunisian people with the transition can do is try and target their assistance at some of the core issues. And I would put job creation very high on that list to deal with the country's unemployment problem. And one of the ways that can be done is by reducing trade barriers. Certainly when I was in Tunis in a governmental role, and since I've advocated for the US to initiate negotiations on a free trade agreement with Tunisia, both for the agreement itself, but also for the signal it would send to other international investors. So I think that's one thing that could be done. The United States established a fund to help spur entrepreneurship and job creation. I think that's important to continue efforts like that. Many other forms of assistance in terms of technical assistance, but I'd also refer back to a comment I made during my remarks, which is gaining stability in Libya is going to be very important for Tunisia, and Fabio pointed to the trade relations particularly between the South and Tripolitania, and also I think in terms of foreign investor confidence as well.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Imen, do you have a couple of thoughts on this?
Yes, and thank you very much, Ambassador Gordon and Fabio, for your excellent analysis on Tunisia. I'm really impressed by that. Maybe I will answer to a question on the chat. It's about the CSOs and the funding for CSOs. And I will say that funding often does not lead to the desired results, especially when it comes to supporting civil society. CSOs obtain funding, but public structures are unable to play the role of donor, maybe because of instability, and therefore CSOs are only depends on external funding, because they are not able to take funds from public institution. And we have the case of Ministry of Social Affairs, which give 1 million for CSOs, but the CSOs work on rehabilitation and reintegration didn't take that funds because of bureaucratic challenges. For the donor supports for CSOs, I think that the lack of coordination between them to build on the results of previous project is very, very present. The CSOs needs more support and more structured funding, and not in the form of one-off response and one punctual response. With the current programs, I will be very honest and very transparent to say that with the current programs for civil society, we are creating two categories of CSOs: the privileged ones, and which has access to funds, which have access to trainings, and others working on field, and especially in some rural places where and they are deprived of tools and deprived of access to finance. So maybe we have to rethink our programs to support CSOs and to be more efficient and to be more in a better collaborative way. We have another question on returnees. Can I give some points also there?
Maybe I'll just turn really quickly to Youssef on this and also on the previous question, and then we'll return back to you. So just to turn to you, Youssef. So there was one question regarding what international partners can do further to help Tunisia, and there is also one question from my colleague Amanda Paul on how Tunisian authorities deal with the returning foreign fighters. Is there any strategy to tackle the radicalization?
So what the international community can do, I mean, some of my colleagues in this panel already mentioned a few points, and there are tons of recommendations. What I can say from, at least in my opinion, the priority number one and short-term priority is COVID-19. Of course, the Tunisian authorities are doing things about COVID-19, but because of the bureaucratic delays and the current political crisis, I think that's being slowed. So this is something that should be tackled between Tunisia and the international community, perhaps between donors, the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization and others who could work directly either with Institut Pasteur in Tunisia or other places that are tackling directly and on the ground COVID-19, because this is a growing problem, and that I don't think Tunisia is really able to cope with it, and the numbers are growing day after day. That's one immediate priority. Then, of course, there are what the international community can do towards improving the economy and so on. I think this is much more long-term, and there are a few projects already happening. But in my humble opinion, there are maybe two big things that should continue to happen in Tunisia that could improve the economic situation, but it's much broader than that. One, there was, since 2011, a growing number of scholarships for Tunisian students, and mostly the easy ones, so the master's degree scholarships. I think these should continue and their number should increase, because then that means already in the last 10 years, we've had thousands of Tunisians who got a very good education in some very good schools in Europe, in the US, and so on. That doesn't cost that much for the donors. And that helps a lot these Tunisian students who received a certain number of skills and who just need this maybe 1 year to improve their skills and be even more employable. So this is one thing that should continue, and that actually changed the lives of thousands of Tunisians, and especially these young Tunisians who are becoming the future of this country, who were the future of this country, and who are now becoming the present of this country, not just the future. The other second and very important point that I hope the international community will keep doing is to openly express support for democracy in this country and to stress on that. Tunisia is not just about stopping migration or facing terrorism, but Tunisia is about democracy. And this is something that, of course, a lot of Tunisians are defending democracy, but a lot of Tunisians are also losing hope and losing faith in democracy. So when they see this recurrent message about support for democracy, this is something that is important and that should continue to happen. So these are for whatever I can give as recommendations to the international community. Now, to the second point, which I'm not fully expert on, but I think there are a number of strategies. But what I can say about that is that, yes, there is the threat of Tunisian extremists who went to Syria and other places and who came back. That threat is always around. Yes, there were a few terrorist attacks in Tunisia in the last in the last year, actually, be it in front of the US Embassy a year ago, or some other attacks, including the one of yesterday that killed a number of Tunisian soldiers. So terrorism is still alive in Tunisia, and it is still hurting and harming Tunisian citizens and the Tunisian economy and state. But it is not a growing threat. So these thousands of Tunisians who went abroad, and many of them came back, or they have family, or they have supporters here in Tunisia, we haven't seen an uprising, a jihadi uprising in Tunisia. And it's been 10 years. I mean, again, that's why I keep going back to this thing. It's been 10 years. We're not talking about 1 or 2 years. It's 10 years. So we've seen almost everything. We haven't seen a jihadi uprising in the country. So yes, it's important to keep an eye on terrorists and on extremism and to keep fighting it, but it should not be the #1 priority before health conditions, education, economic empowerment, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef, for your thoughts. Maybe just I would maybe turn to you for a little while, to Ambassador Gray. How can the US help further Tunisia counter-terrorism? I'm sure you have a few ideas in this sense, and I think it would be very useful for the audience to listen to them.
Well, I think there are a number of programs that that the US government has already embarked on. One is training. There's been the pace of training, it really has picked up. In other words, giving the Tunisian security forces, and particularly the Tunisian military, the capabilities they need, because they're best placed to fight the terrorist threat. And also, I would say the increase in security assistance, just in terms of the materiel that the Tunisian military needs. If I recall correctly, when we were in Tunisia, when I was in Tunisia 10 years ago, and the military had a very limited number of helicopters, and that's just kind of a basic thing for a military to have. That number has increased. So I think both on training and assistance, intel cooperation, all of those are important factors for any country to combat terrorism, and that's the kind of assistance the United States is providing.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm also mindful of the time, and also want to have a little bit of time for some final remarks. So maybe I would go to you, Fabio, now and ask you something, of course, using my privilege as the moderator. How do you see the future of the EU-Tunisia relations?
Oh, thank you very much for this extremely interesting question, Mihai, that is touching me, of course, directly as a European legislator, but also as a huge friend of Tunisia and a believer in the stronger partnership between the two sides of Mediterranean. Let me say, just to have a general overview to address this question, that you many times reiterates declarations saying that will still remain committed to the financially and politically support the Tunisian democratic transition, assisting it in finding solutions to the most pressing issues and the hardships it faces, reforming administrative, security, judiciary sectors, unemployment and subsidy policies. Since 2011, EU assistance to Tunisia has amounted to almost 3 billion, over 2 billion in grants and 800 million in macrofinancial assistance, also through the European Neighborhood Instrument, the so-called ENI, and the establishment of a privileged partnership in 2012. The fifth meeting of EU-Tunisian Association Council in May 2019 was focused exactly in reinforcing this cooperation under the newly established Horizon Europe, because it's very important also to mention that another important fundamental tool that the EU decided to associate closer Tunisia to the European Union was to enlarge to Tunisia some European programs that are already large to some candidates country and so fundamental partners, and Horizon Europe, formerly Horizon 2020, was one of the most important in this regard because it's touching about scientific research, innovation, and this is of course also a sector in which Tunisia has a lot to say, with brilliant researcher and also important institutions they traditionally have in Tunisian soil. However, again, as I told you, I think that the aspect in which this cooperation bilateral could be more critical is the public administration, because since the consolidation of the revolution, what we observed, it was a kind of problem of obstructive bureaucracy, meaning that the major bureaucratic slowdown are affecting really the timeliness and effectiveness of any intervention. No matter how many funds can be mobilized, again, I stress that there is not effective and efficient public administration able to absorb them. And in this regard, I truly believe that the association of Tunisia with the so-called digital decade of Europe, this important digital transition, is extremely important also to give a powerful tool to the country and to the Tunisian state to react to this challenge. But also, I truly believe that the European countries that are closer to Tunisia for cultural, historical ties, or also because for bilateral agreements, I'm thinking about especially, first of all, Italy, France, Spain, but even Germany, that showed a great interest, could try to launch also bilateral programs between their public administration and the Tunisian one to work on some best practices that can be implemented, especially in light of the fact that in Tunisia there is also a devolution process. We have, I was in the Tunisian parliament when the local code, the code of local collectivities was approved. It was an historical moment because from the centrality of the dictatorship, we were again shifting the power to the local powers, the politics that, as I often said, you can touch. The politics that is affecting your daily quality of life. And one way from which people can regain trust, of course, in politics is having a very strong democratic impact at the local level, seeing that local mayorship have the means, the powers, and the tools to deliver them and to create also with the bottom up approach, a new political class of leaders coming also from the local, going up then to the state. And in this regard, there are many important traditions in Europe of countries in which this element of localism is extremely sensible and important, and that can help. But also, let's not forget that this process has not ended. There is normally, the constitution is also foreseen the creation of regions in Tunisia that has not yet been realized. And also in this regard, there are many European models that can be useful in sharing and trying to shape the best practice, the best model that can be implemented in Tunisia. But again, I stress on the importance of the local element. Again, just as I was mentioning briefly before, the need to negotiate a fair agreement on the DCFTA, the so-called ALECA. I know very well the fears and the concerns coming from UGTT, coming from also the Tunisian businessmen and associations. There is a huge fear that this agreement could not be a bridge between EU and Tunisia, but to divide the public opinion, to create a polarization. That's why I think that Europe has the important need and important duty to reassure and to show with concrete means that this is focused on to promote the economic modernization and growth, to promote employment, to strengthen and stabilize the Tunisian economy, and not to try to use the Tunisian potential for a European benefit of interest. This is going to be, in my opinion, crucial, and that's why I was advocating in favor of this asymmetricality, somehow, of the agreement, putting really that into a wider framework. We should not speak about just commerce and economic. We are speaking about a democracy that must be supported in the same way Europe, for example, was supporting also the democracies coming from, let's say, from the ashes of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe before. It's true that according to the so-called Copenhagen criteria, Tunisia is not eligible to join the European Union, but that does not change anything on the importance and the impact that have its association together with Europe for our growth, for our future, and for our stability. So it's about to create a kind of all-around partnership, making a better use of the tools we already created, but also trying to getting out from a kind of narrative, as was said before very well, that Tunisia could be just a buffer zone to stop trafficking in human beings, to provide security against terrorism. That's not what we are speaking about. As Youssef was saying before, we are speaking about, on the contrary, an association with a country that share the same values, that share the same principle, that share the same vision of the European Union. And in that aspect, of course, also this issue of illegal migration and security are part, but are just one single piece of a much more wider important framework. And I reiterate also on the fact that the best way to stop illegal migration is to create economic growth, because nobody is keen and happy to leave its own family, his own country. You are doing that when you are desperate. I come from a country that has been for a long time a country of people that were emigrating in the rest of the world because they had no possibility to grow up their family, to create a future in their homeland soil. And so I fully understand this perception. We should not see the relationship with the southern shores of the Mediterranean as a security issue, but with a common mutual interest and benefit. And that should try to be implemented more and more in the public debate. Even the concept of migration, let's get out of this demonization. Let's speak about, again, circular migration. That was one of the key points of my report in 2016, when I was asking to create, let's say, also special visa regime for students, for researchers, for artists, for cult people coming from the world of culture, and even try to enlarge it, but that with the perspective not to deprive Tunisia of their best minds and those one who can really make the future of the country and innovation, but to give them possibility to come to Europe, to achieve more knowledge, more personal growth, and then to come back to deliver that to their own country. That's really the idea of the circular migration we must try to promote with our action and with our concrete measures. Again, I also stress on the fact that Tunisia must be absolutely associated with the so-called Green Deal. That's going to be the revolution for the European Union in terms of sustainability and in terms of also of energetic safety and a model of vision on the continent that is also really linked also to the quality and the protection of the environment in the Mediterranean. That it is the most important patrimony that we have both defend from both sides, something that cannot be delocalized happily. That it's our greatest richness. And I truly believe that Tunisia is incredible, important biodiversity, for the excellency of its agriculture, but also again for its characteristics from a climatic point of view, can be perfect to be seen as another piece of the puzzle that we are trying to create with the Green Deal. So that means again to associate as much as possible in every single program also Tunisia, consider again as a special partner and not another, let's say, normal partner as some other countries in the area that, as I told you, do not share the same values, do not have democratic structures, and so they cannot be seen and cannot be put again the same level. Let's for once just not let real politics prevail, but let's speak about the politics of values and principles to prevail and to deliver that into concrete means. And again, I think that is extremely important to associate that this effort with renewable energies. There is a project to interconnect Sicily and Tunisia through an important cable through the Mediterranean. At the beginning, can be seen as a possibility for Tunisia to avoid to build up useless electrical engines, especially during the summer when there is more request of energy also for climatization. And so this can be an occasion, but this interconnection can work also in the other sense, in the sense that Tunisia can be a champion of renewable energies for its climatic characteristics, and then again create power, growth, employment in a sector that will be the sector of the future if we want to really think about growth and at the same time and the defense of the environment. So I really think that again we have an opportunity in front of us. Tunisia clearly showed that on political and especially on human rights side that they delivered incredible results that no other Arab country has delivered so far. And so they deserve to see this partnership in concrete terms. There are still some things to do. I want to be honest. Even in my report, I observed, for example, that there is an important, again, still to repeal the Article 2030 of the Penal Code, which still criminalizes the homosexuality. There are also an important need to re-seeing all the laws that are ruling the use of the police force, to implement them and to put them totally into the framework of the constitutional principles. But Tunisia, this civil society, more than its political class, really deserves to see Europe at the height of the ambition we have to fulfill. And I hope that these few remarks can try to foster the dialogue and again put under the spotlight the importance of this support, especially now that COVID-19 is really putting and bringing the situation to a critical point. Let's not really try to be focused just on our internal problem, because also the Tunisian problem, I consider them domestic European problem for the impact they could have, and also for the responsibility we had with them when we morally and politically promised to be together side by side in this important path of consolidation of democracy that Tunisian freely decided to implement.
Thank you, Fabio. Sorry also to interrupt you. I'm also mindful of the time. We went a bit over, but the ideas that all the speakers had are very interesting. And I would just, if with your permission, to take a little bit of your time also to give you the chance to give a few final remarks. For instance, also maybe you would like to tackle the EU-Tunisia relations, the US-Tunisia relations, or maybe you would like to have a forward look on what the next 5 to 10 years can bring. So maybe really quickly, in maximum 1-2 minutes, to have your thoughts. I would maybe start with you, Youssef, and then go to Imen, and then finish with Ambassador Gray. Youssef, you have the floor.
Well, I think the situation can lead anywhere. I mean, it could improve if there is a better economic conditions regionally that may impact Tunisia, and if the COVID-19 pandemic is slowed. So then that is the positive scenario, where we would see maybe also new politicians coming in, maybe through early elections, and maybe would see better structured political parties, especially if we're talking about the next 10 years. But also there is the negative scenario, sadly, with all the problems that we see in the country, there are a lot of negative scenarios that can happen. I mean, this transition to democracy can stop, sadly. I mean, we've seen just recently in Myanmar what happened, so it's never guaranteed. Therefore, again, what I want to say is that we're witnessing something that is happening in the last 10 years. It's ongoing. We hope that it lasts, but it is a very fragile situation, and there is a major discontent in the street, and it's understandable. So that's why there is a need for maybe more social peace in the country, but also more international support.
Thank you, Youssef. Now over to you, Imen, for some final remarks really quickly, because I'm also mindful of your time. Thank you.
Very, very quickly, I want to say some words regarding the returnees. We live now in Tunisia. We live in a total denial of this phenomenon. It was politicized with the law, which was going to be presented. Currently, we have no, we have mainly a security and judicial response for those who participated in acts of violent extremism. They are arrested, and after that they are released to the into society without a coherent support program within society. So we have a few initiatives from civil society, but unless that, we have no clear structured response program to this phenomenon. By the end, I will say Tunisia is at the heart of the Mediterranean Sea, which is the heart of the world. So please make sure that this heart remains alive and radiant. Tunisia is a young democracy. Let's support it so that it succeeds by funding the common ground of Tunisians, and I'm sure that tomorrow will be a better day for Tunisia.
Thank you very much, Imen. And Ambassador Gray, over to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on the optimistic note that Imen just ended on. I think that Tunisian society has the capability to succeed, even though these are difficult times. I mean, remember, the revolution happened just in the wake of the Eurozone crisis. There are difficulties now because of the pandemic. But look, if we're taking a slightly longer view as far as the 5 or 10 years down, all of the essential blocks, building blocks for success exist within Tunisian society. So between those building blocks, between the successes that we've seen to date, and with the assistance of some foreign partners, I'm confident that we'll see Tunisia continue to make progress and serve as a beacon for other countries as well.
Thank you very much for ending in this note. Just to really quickly like to take this opportunity to thank you for your presentations, for your insights, and also for your ideas. I also would like to thank our audience for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to other discussions on Tunisia. Thank you very much once again.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maslama.
Thank you. Bislama.
Bislama.